1966 would generally be a great year for General Motors, and the company was turning out a number of vehicles that were great lookers in the mid-1960s. Many of the vehicles that General Motors was selling were selling quite well, and that included over at the Oldsmobile division. However, 1966 would represent a relatively sad day in the eyes of some over at Oldsmobile, for it would signify the end of the run for a very brief, let's say, nameplate that lasted only from 1961 through 1966 during at least this particular time frame in this generation of car, and that is for the Olds Starfire. The car that was introduced in 1961 is the range-topping Olds that came only in convertible form and had beautiful side trim and an immensely detailed interior, complete with leather bucket seats and a center console. Well, that car had really evolved and morphed over time. More specifically, in 1962, there was a coupe that was added to the convertible in the Starfire lineup. And then that continued all the way through the 1965 model year, where both coupes and convertibles were offered in Starfire form. Now, after 1965 and for the 1966 model year, the Starfire was only available in coupe format. So it actually dropped the convertible format, which is how the car started in the first place. And also for 1966, Oldsmobile decontented the Starfire versus the 1965 model because they got rid of the Jetstar 1 model in the lineup, which was effectively a lower-priced Starfire that didn't have as much standard equipment. And so for 1966, the Starfire, which once came standard with power steering, power brakes, power windows, leather interior, now had a vinyl interior standard, didn't have power steering or brake standard, didn't have power windows standard, and the price decreased commensurately year over year from 1965 to 1966. So like other General Motors cars that went out to pasture, the Starfire kind of ended with a whimper versus where it started. It didn't end as the range-topping vehicle in Oldsmobile's lineup because, of course, not only was the 98 priced higher than the Starfire in 1966, you also had an all-new Oldsmobile that was introduced for 1966, the Tornado. And the fact that the Tornado was introduced and it came with a 425 cubic inch high compression, 385 horsepower V8 also meant that the Starfire really lost one of the things that made it special, and that was that when it was introduced, you got the most powerful Oldsmobile V8 underhood standard in the Starfire. And all throughout the 1960s, the Starfire, until 1966, came with Oldsmobile's range-topping V8 engine with the highest horsepower. You could option up to the Starfire V8 and some other models, but you got it standard in the Starfire, and by 1966, the highest horsepower engine in the Starfire was a 375 horsepower, 425 cubic inch V8. And as I mentioned, the Tornado had 10 more horsepower. So the Tornado had taken over the Starfire's crown as the most powerful Olds. And the Tornado certainly had all new looks and style. But the Starfire also, to me, the 66 Starfire is a real gem from a styling perspective. So let's talk a little bit more about it as well as the car itself. Now let's begin the journey with the 1966 Oldsmobile brochure, because this is a really telling page, or 2 pages from the brochure. First of all, other models in this brochure got a full 2-page spread with a picture of the vehicle, but not the Starfire, nor the 442 for that matter. The Starfire here just kind of gets a little 1-page section. And if you notice, the text talks about, of course, the 425 cubic inch V8. As I mentioned, it makes 375 horsepower, talks about a road leveling 4-coil ride, thin shell bucket seats. But notice the last portion of what the copy says here in the brochure. It says, all this and more included in Starfire's attractive price. Well, price was never the objective of, a low price was never the objective of the Starfire in the first place. As I mentioned, it started as a range topper, and here it was kind of relegated to more of a value sporty car status, if you will. If you wanted the full all-on sports car from Olds, you got the 442 that was on the page to the right. So between the Tornado that was luxurious and powerful and had the most powerful V8 and the 442, which was far cheaper and had a very powerful engine underhood, I think the Starfire just kind of got sandwiched out and people really didn't know what to do with it. You only bought the Starfire because you liked its looks, and its looks, while great, were less, I would say, controversial than the Tornado's. Let's take a look at the looks department, if you will, by examining this particular 66 Starfire. Now, before somebody kind of criticizes me for showing a car that does not have the stock wheels, it's really tough to find a picture of a stock 66 Starfire. These cars are just almost non-existent by this point. They didn't sell very well, particularly at the end of the run. And as a consequence, well, the pictures are hard to find of these Starfires. But yeah, the body's the same as any Starfire. The wheels are just something that you can change out. But you see the car has a typical W-shaped front end to it, where the fenders, the tips of the fenders, as well as that center section of the hood, if you're looking at them from a bird's eye view, they form a W shape. And again, very popular styling trait for General Motors designers during this time. Another thing you'll notice is that the barbell theme here, where the area of the car toward the ends, the outer portions, versus the midsection, it's a little bit less exaggerated here than on some other Oldsmobiles. You get certainly the barbell theme in terms of the leading piece of bright work at the edge of the hood and the fender. But the hood and the fender don't have as large of a bulge as what you see as an example on the Tornado, where the barbell theme is even stronger. Of course, you do have a hefty wind split molding that runs the entire length of the hood, something you never see today because that would be against pedestrian impact standards. Now, as we flip to the rear, we have a number of interesting design cues here. First, notice the concave style rear window or backlight. And that was something that emulated the Pontiac Grand Prix's backlight ever since the Grand Prix was introduced in 1963. So in 1963, if you got a Starlight Coupe, you got that concave backlight just like the Grand Prix, and obviously continued through to the end of the run here for the Starfire in 1966. The second thing I'll point out is this crease that kind of runs the length of the car and hops over the rear wheel. That's a cue quite similar to the Tornado and how you have a similar but very different type of style. The Tornado has much bigger wheel arches and has a line that runs across the entire car, hopping over both wheels. Here, of course, you have this line as a supplement to the wheel arches, whereas the Tornado, it forms them. So it's different, but it's similar. It's got a little bit of a similar cue to it, so that you thought there was some Oldsmobile DNA here. Now, to me, the most interesting thing about this particular photo is the rear treatment. Notice that you have the W-shaped rear end, just like the front, as we discussed, where the quarter panels kind of pull out and the midsection of the trunk pulls out as well. But the strange thing to me is that the Starfire really eschewed a typical Oldsmobile trait when it came to rear-end graphics, and that would be most Oldsmobiles of this era and subsequently. If you think about the taillights in particular and the graphics of Oldsmobiles from the rear, how do you recognize an Oldsmobile? Well, it often had these blocky tail lamps, kind of rectangles or squares, and that was the Oldsmobile signature. And in fact, that was what the rear of the 65 Starfire looked like. But for whatever reason, in 1966, Oldsmobile designers elected to go with this cross-hatched pattern and the blacked out portions in the midsection of the rear, which was very un-Oldsmobile-like. Not quite sure why they wanted to do that or what they thought the rationale was here. Didn't necessarily tie in with the front end of the car either, because there was no egg crate grille up front or cross-hatching. It was just an interesting design out back. And here's the dead-on rear view that, to me, because of this particular treatment with the cross-hatching and the egg crate like texture, if you had this car going backwards, it could almost look like the front end of a car with hidden headlamps. And I wonder if that was intentional or it just happened. To me, in fact, this looks a little bit like the front end of a 1968 Riviera. Of course, the Riviera had a much larger loop bumper style grille, but the way that the deck lid has that crease running down the middle, and then how it kind of has this kink in it as it comes rearward, that the deck lid drops down to meet the tail lamp as well as the trim panel there in the middle. That to me just evokes memories of the 68 Riviera. Again, acknowledging the 68 Riviera has a much thicker loop bumper, but I don't know, looks similar to me. You can also see from this particular photo that the C-pillars, look how inset they are from the outer edge of the body, something you don't see today, in part because obviously this impinges upon interior space, and the Starfire could afford to do so because it was so wide, but pulling the C-pillar in like that really set up the surface there to help define that kick up over the rear wheel. And you really can see it in this photo because of the lighting. And this car appears to have a non-metallic paint, but if this had a metallic paint, it would even be more accentuated than what you see here. So the way that the designers had set up that beautiful C-pillar sets up the quarter panel, which has a Tornado SQ. And I think the car overall is just a handsome vehicle. It's too bad the Starfire had to go out after 1966, but I guess it's time for the Tornado to have its day in the spotlight after this point. Now, let's take a look at the interior of the Starfire, and I have to say it's still a great-looking interior with these bucket seats, the center console, the beautiful four-spoke steering wheel that Oldsmobile employed in its other vehicles. This is the tilt and telescoping wheel as well, so you can move it in and out as well as up and down. But as I mentioned at the start of the video, the Starfire was decontented year over year, and a number of the power goodies that were once standard in 1965 were no longer standard, nor was the leather interior. Here you got vinyl. So Oldsmobile did push the Starfire down market. I wonder if that was just because they wanted to also make some room for the Tornado at the top of the lineup, and perhaps they just felt that adding the Tornado, they had to get rid of the Jetstar, and they wanted the Starfire to try to play in a different space than it was doing when it was originally introduced in 1961. So nonetheless, I think the interior is quite attractive. If I had bought this car, I would be happy with what the interior looks like. It just wasn't as rich and finely detailed as it once was. So here's the dash and a close-up of the interior of the 66 Starfire. Notice you have this Cyclops-style speedometer, which was pretty atypical for the time, although Mercury would have that in 67 and 68. You have this interesting theme where it's kind of flanked by two different sections of the instrument panel, which are unequal in size. On the left, you have a relatively small pod with the fuel gauge, the wiper control, the headlamp control. On the right, you've got the HVAC, the radio, some other controls, cigarette lighter, etc., and of course the glove box. But kind of a strange theme. I don't think I've ever seen another car quite like this in terms of one that had an instrument panel similar to it. But I think it looks pretty good. It does look a little bit more down market and plain Jane versus what was in the Starfire a couple of years earlier. Now, under hood in your Starfire, there was one engine that was available, and that was the 375 horsepower, 425 cubic inch V8 engine. And as I mentioned, the Tornado had the range-topping 425 at 385 horsepower. If you got an Olds 98 as an example, came standard with a 425 with 365 horsepower. There was a little bit of a difference between the variants, but we're not talking about a huge spread. Regardless, the Starfire did come with a powerful V8 engine, and the Olds 425 really was an excellent V8. It was around from 1965 through 1967. In 1968, it would be enlarged to the largest displacement that Oldsmobile would ever make for a V8, which was the 455 cubic inch V8, and that would continue on in production all the way through to 1976. One of the things I will say about this is if you own an Oldsmobile of this era with one of these high compression 425 engines, you will be just amazed at how smooth and powerful they are. You'll key the starter because you don't even know that the engine's running, at least if you have a stock style exhaust on the car. But I have a 67 Olds 88 with a 425, and I just have to say the GM V8s of this era by and large are pretty amazing. So you did still get this in your Starfire in 1966. And then in 1967, well, the Starfire V8 as part of the engine lineup would be gone along with the car. So what do you think about the Olds Starfire from 1966? I think it's a super cool Olds. I'd love to have one of these, but there just weren't many that were made. And so as a consequence, there aren't many left today. Few people saved them. Thanks again for watching, and till next time, take care.